The 100 Years' War was fought between England and France. It was a continuous conflict that lasted from 1337 to 1453. The countries were at war because of the dispute of whom the legitimate successors were to the French kingdoms, as well as the ownership of several French territories. The war began in 1337 when King Edward III of England declared himself King of France over Philip VI, and thus King Edward III invaded the French territory of Flanders. The conflict continued as a series of land battles, sieges, and disputes throughout the 14th century, with both the French and the English variously taking advantage. When the young English prince, Henry V, ascended to the English throne in 1413, there had been a long ceasefire between the French and English. A truce had been formally declared in 1396 that was meant to last 28 years. That was sealed by the marriage of the French king's daughter, Charles VI, to King Richard II of England. However, with a need to reassert his authority at home, as well as his own ambition and a sense of justice, led Henry V to renew the English claims in France. England had been divided with political discord since Henry IV of the House of Lancaster, Henry V's father, had usurped the throne from Richard II in 1399. Since then, there had been tension between the nobility and the royal house. Widespread crime and lawlessness plagued the English kingdom, and several attempts were made on Henry V's life. The situation in England, coupled with the fact that France was weakened by its own political crisis and the insanity of the French King Charles VI, had resulted in a fight for power among the French nobility, which made it an ideal opportunity for Henry to invade France and press his claims. Henry V made demands of the French to hand over French lands to the English kingdom. When the French rejected Henry's substantial territorial demands, he invaded France. Henry and his army arrived in Normandy on August 1415 with a force of about 12,000 English soldiers, and immediately laid siege to the French city of Harfleur. The city was starved out and eventually surrendered within 6 weeks. However, the siege was costly to Henry's army. It lasted longer than Henry had anticipated, and his army numbers were significantly diminished as a result of casualties, desertions, and disease. Departing from Harfleur on October 8, Henry's army marched northward toward the English-held port of Calais, where his army would disembark for England with a force of roughly 1,000 English knights and men-at-arms and 5,000 English longbow archers. Henry's force was unable to cross the Somme River because of French defences. He was forced to take a detour inland and cross farther upstream. The delay allowed a large French force led by the constable, Charles d'Albret, and the marshal, Jean II, whom was also known as Boussaquet, to catch up with Henry's force near the village of Agincourt. On October 24th, the English were not in an ideal condition to fight a battle. Their army had been weakened by the siege of Harfleur and marched over 200 miles, and many among them were suffering from diseases and starvation. By most contemporary accounts, the French army was also significantly larger than the English, though the exact degree of their numerical superiority is disputed among historians. Common estimates place the English army at roughly 6,000 men, while the French army probably consisted of about 20,000 to 30,000 men. This suggests that the French could have outnumbered the English 5-1, though other historians estimated the French army to be no more than 12,000, indicating that the English were still outnumbered 2-1. It seems clear, however, that the English were at a major numerical disadvantage. Early morning on October 25, 1415, Henry positioned his army for battle on a recently ploughed field bounded by woods. The landscape was heavily covered in woods, which Henry used to his advantage by positioning his army as such. His men-at-arms were stationed in the centre of the battlefield, flanked by wedges of archers who carried longbows that had an effective range of about 250 yards. Both flanks of Henry's army were covered in dense woodland. This prevented the French heavy mounted knights from flanking Henry's army. Thus, the battlefield only allowed for frontal attacks, which would have made the French's numerical advantage obsolete, as they could not flank nor attack Henry's army from the rear. Also, the terrain was watered down and muddied by a heavy rainstorm the days prior. This also favoured Henry's army and disadvantaged the heavy mounted French knights, which would inevitably be slowed down whilst riding forward. The French saw that Henry's force was depleted of food and resources, and thus wanted to starve his army out. Henry knew that he had to act quickly if he was to have any chance of defeating the French. So in the last throw of the dice, Henry brought the fight to the French. He ordered his army to uproot and advance forward. The battle commenced at 11 a.m. as the English brought the longbows within killing range, and the first line of French mounted knights advanced forward. The field that the French had to cross to meet their enemy was heavily muddied after a week of heavy rainfall, which slowed their advance, during which time they endured casualties from English arrows. The English longbowmen used a special arrow tip called a bodkin tip, which allowed for better armour penetration. When the first French line reached the English front, the cavalry were unable to overwhelm the archers, who had driven sharpened stakes into the ground at an angle in front of themselves. This was an innovative technique that the English had not used in the battles of Crécy and Poitiers. Eventually, the archers abandoned their longbows and began fighting hand-to-hand with swords and axes alongside the men-at-arms. The next line of French infantry that poured in found themselves so tightly packed together as the field narrowed at the English end. They were unable to use their weapons effectively, and the tide of the battle began to turn toward the English. The third line of the French army, recoiling at the pile of corpses before them and unable to make an effective charge, was then massacred swiftly. As the English were collecting prisoners, a band of French peasants, led by local noblemen, began plundering Henry's baggage lines. Thinking it was an attack from the rear, Henry had the French nobles he was holding prisoner killed. According to some estimates, the battle probably lasted no longer than 3 hours, and was perhaps as short as half an hour. While the precise number of casualties is unknown, it is estimated that the English losses amounted to about 400, while the French losses were estimated to be about 6,000, many of whom were noblemen. The battle was a significant military blow to the French, and it paved the way for further English conquests and successes. The French nobility was weakened by this defeat, and they were divided among themselves. They were unable to meet new attacks with effective resistance. Henry managed to subjugate Normandy in 1419, a victory that was followed by the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which betrothed Henry to King Charles VI's daughter, Catherine, and named him heir to the French crown.